Good morning, everybody. My name is Susan Moffett, and I'm Creative Director of Future Histories Lab and Executive Director of the Global Urban Humanities Initiative. And I'd like to welcome both our students and our public audience in person here at the Osher Theater and our Zoom audience to Humanities 20. Humanities 20 is explorations of art and design at Berkeley, and this fall our theme is landscapes of migration, incarceration, and resistance. And we're very excited to have Greg Sarris with us here today. And we will be getting to our speaker very soon. But before we do that, this is a class, and I have a little bit of housekeeping to do first. And so if our public audience could bear with me while I talk to the students about some things coming up, that would be great. So students, I want to just, since this is the very beginning of the semester, explain a little bit about some logistics. In terms of your questions about attendance or if you are sick, of course, if you're sick, don't come to class, but if you want to do a makeup, please contact the course readers, the course assistants, Adiola and Lauren. Their contact information is in the syllabus. They are also in the people section, and they can answer your questions. They are also the ones who will be marking you present or absent and whether you have made up the work or not. So please be in touch with them. I also want to encourage you to set your notifications for announcements to push the announcements out to your email. You need to get our announcements right away, especially in terms of field trips and other opportunities. You'll be in trouble if you just check in with B courses a couple times a week and you don't get the assignments pushed out to your email. Our field trip to Angel Island for next weekend is full. If you want to be on the wait list, just put your name in the sign up. And if you have signed up and you plan not to go, please let us know as soon as possible. And that contact should be me so that somebody else can take your place. All of the logistics, the timing and so on, all of that information is in the sign-up sheet. I will also be making a very short video just kind of talking through it, and I will be answering any of your questions that you have. If you email me, I will then send out the answers to everybody, because I'm sure if you have a question, other people do too. I also want to say a word about the explorations. As you know, you have a choice of going to an art exhibition, a dance performance, choral performance, and a, what's the fourth one? The exhibition with art, music, exhibition, field trip. But I really encourage you to go to all four. You have to complete the assignment for only one of them. But you know, part of what we're doing in this class is to think about the ways that different art forms address the same issues. And so seeing dance address immigration, listening to music address immigration, looking at art and seeing how different the approaches are to the same thing, that's what you're going to get a lot out of in this class. So I encourage you to go to all of the explorations if you can. And I just want to mention, I went to the world premiere of Lenore Lee's In the Movement at ODC Theater last night, and it was amazing. This is one of your options for explorations. And this is contemporary dance about immigration and detention. And the dancers are moving not to music, but to the voices of refugees and immigrants telling their often harrowing stories. And it's incredibly powerful. And I really encourage you to go. The dates are in the Explorations assignment number 1. And I want to let you know that because I think it's so important that you attend this if you can. Previously, we had announced that there's a student discount and you could get tickets for $15. I have found some additional funding, and so if you want to go, I can arrange for your comped tickets, so you can get in for free, but you have to email me and tell me in advance which date you want to go. It's only this weekend and next Thursday through Sunday. There are both matinees and evening performances, so please look them up, and I really encourage you to go. It's a fantastic and very powerful piece. So that is the our housekeeping. And now I want to move on to our main attraction, which is to think about Angel Island in the context of Indigenous California. And I want to start by acknowledging that here in Berkeley, we are in the territory of Huichin, which is the ancestral homeland and the current home of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. And we will be talking more in the course of today about land acknowledgements. But as I said last week, the important thing is not to go through this rote ritual at the beginning of classes and events, but to really go beyond that and think more deeply and take action based on knowledge that we hopefully are acquiring about Indigenous California. Also, Angel Island is located in the ancestral homeland of the Coast Miwok people. And it's important to acknowledge that. And in fact, that is why our first speaker today, Greg Sarris, is representing that tribe. And I thought it was really important that if we were going to be thinking about immigration and all the people who came to California, that we have a picture of what California looked like before all of us who are immigrants and who came from other places arrived. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I'm really excited that we have Professor Beth Piatote to be in conversation with Greg Sarris, and I'll give a full introduction in a minute. But I want to start with a little bit of kind of imagination and bodily presence exercise. We did this last time to imagine what it felt like to be inside the detention barracks at Angel Island. And today, especially because this is the beginning of the semester, most of you have not had a chance to go to Angel Island yet, I want us to really think about where Angel Island is in San Francisco Bay and in the world. And so I also want to let you know that part of the reason that I wanted to start this whole year of performances and exhibitions and creative projects using Angel Island as a jumping off point for thinking about these things is that I look at Angel Island every single morning. So my habit is in the morning before work, I bicycle down to San Francisco Bay and I go to Albany Beach and I go for a swim. And when I swim, I'm doing the breaststroke and I'm staring straight out at Angel Island. And so I'd like all of you to kind of join in imagining this place and this perspective. And, you know, as we did before, if it helps to close your eyes to imagine, feel free to do so. But imagine that you are in the water and your eyes, you're swimming along, and your eyes are just, you know, at water level, kind of like a seal. And you're staring straight west out toward the Golden Gate Bridge across 10 miles of water. And the Golden Gate Bridge, the towers, the red towers are rising up through the fog. And off to the left is San Francisco and the skyscrapers of the financial district. And then straight ahead is Alcatraz. So Alcatraz is in front of the Golden Gate Bridge. And the thing about Alcatraz, especially when you're at water level, it doesn't look like an island. It looks more like a ship because it's pretty small. And the outline of the island is made by the prison buildings. So there's this funny little kind of ship shape in front of the Golden Gate Bridge. And then off to the right is Angel Island, which is much bigger. It's a mountain. It looks like a mountain. It is a mountain. And as we talked about last time, why is it that Alcatraz is so much more famous than Angel Island? Why is it that we tell stories of Ellis Island in New York and immigration there, and we know so little about Angel Island here? So this is the landscape that we're looking at in the water. And often when I'm in the water, I keep looking west past the Golden Gate, and I'm imagining way across the Pacific. It's the other side of the Pacific where my ancestors came from Japan. And they came across the Pacific and made a life here in California, and then they were incarcerated during World War II at Manzanar in the US concentration camps. That's part of my history. Another part of my history is when I look out across the Pacific and over to China. The white side of my family, they were engaged in the 19th century in the China trade. And as a teenager, I heard kind of romantic stories about, you know, the trade in porcelain and silk and tea, but also opium was an essential part of that trade. So my ancestors were drug dealers who the unrest and the disruption that caused in China and the Opium Wars, that's part of the story. That's part of how people ended up coming here. And those Chinese immigrants, they came for the gold rush, they helped build the railroads. That in turn caused incredible disruption and displacement of Native American peoples. So all of this is really complicated. And I hope by the end of this semester that you will, when you walk around, you'll realize there are so many stories in the landscape and that you have a personal connection, one way or another, through very complicated threads to all of these histories. And we need to learn that. Finally, before we move on to our speakers, I just want to ask you to imagine, okay, before the skyscrapers, before Alcatraz, the prison, were there, what did this landscape look like? Well, San Francisco was mostly sand dunes. Alcatraz was a rocky island without prisons on it. Imagine the forests of the Sierras and the grasslands, and imagine California before the Europeans and people from Asia and elsewhere came. And you may have a picture in your mind of a very beautiful place, which it was. And now I want to ask you to think about the language. What are some words that are occurring to you as you are conjuring up this California? Maybe you're thinking of words like pristine wilderness or untouched landscapes. And I ask you, please take those words and throw them out the window, at least for now, because this was not wilderness until Westerners came and labeled it as such. It was home, and the land was not untouched. It was filled with people. There were a whole lot of people here who were touching the land and stewarding it and altering it and taking care of it all the time. And so the landscapes that we see, the native plants in California, they were shaped. They co-evolved with the native peoples who were here, who used fire so much more wisely than we manage fire today. But let's not think about untouched, pristine, unpeopled California. That's the maybe one of the most important things I hope that you take away from today. And also to remember that, as we'll hear from Greg, that Indigenous Californians are very, very much here among us. So now I want to introduce Greg Sarris and also Beth Piatote. And I think there's no better person than Greg to help us think about Angel Island in the context of California, in the context of Indigenous California. He is serving his 14th term as the elected chairman of the Federated Indians of Graton, Rancheria, representing Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo people in Sonoma and Marin counties. He's the author of many books dealing with the Native American experience, including Becoming Story, his latest book, which has just come out. And he is also the author of the novel Watermelon Nights, the short story collection Grand Avenue, which was made into an HBO miniseries, How a Mountain Was Made, a collection of stories inspired by Coast Miwok and Pomo creation tales, and a book about the renowned Pomo basket weaver Mabel McKay. He is also a playwright and producer of documentaries and vice chair of the board of the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. He has a PhD in modern thought and literature from Stanford and has been a professor at UCLA, Loyola Marymount, and Sonoma State University. A native of Santa Rosa, Chairman Sarris represents the Coast Miwok people whose ancestral territory includes Angel Island. And I'm going to, at this point, also introduce Beth Piatote, although she'll be coming up later. Beth Piatote is a creative writer, playwright, and scholar. She is the author of The Beadworkers, a mixed-genre literary collection, the plays Tricksters Unite, and Antigone, a retelling of the Greek tragedy of Antigone and its themes of resistance and of what the living owe the dead. It centers on a Native American family torn apart over the fate of ancestral remains held by a museum. She is an Indigenous language activist and is Nez Perce, enrolled with the Colville Confederated Tribes. She is an associate professor of comparative literature and English here at Berkeley and director of the Arts Research Center. And I want to say that we are so delighted at Future Histories Lab and also Arts and Design to have the Arts Research Center as our partner in A Year on Angel Island, the project of which this speaker series is one part. And I'd like to highlight one wonderful Arts Research Center event coming up in the spring. It's a poetry reading by Claire Moischke, who addresses the experiences of the immigration trial of her ancestor at Angel Island, an ancestor who was of mixed Chinese and Alaska Native heritage. And to learn more about that event and other performances, exhibitions, and creative projects in A Year on Angel Island, please visit our website at futurehistories.berkeley.edu. And now I hope everyone will help me give a very warm welcome to Greg Sarris.
Well, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? I might, but good, thank you. Again, I want to thank all of you for coming this morning and being interested. I want to thank Susan and Beth, the organizers of this class. What a great idea. I mean, a steady place. I was saying earlier to Susan that sometimes I worry that so much of my work has been focused on one place. And I think it's so important that we, in thinking about one place, we can also think about the world wherever we are. But most of all, this morning, I want to welcome all of you. I want to certainly acknowledge the Indigenous people who were here and are here now from this land where we're sitting today. But all of us are sitting here today, and we have to find ways that we can sustain our well-being in place and time here. So I hope my small little lecture and talk about the Indigenous people, about Angel Island, and then about my own people from the same area and language families will be helpful and shed some light. The large irony is that when you talk about Angel Island and you talk about so many immigrants coming, strangers in a new place, the history of what's happened to Indigenous people is that so many of us became strangers in our homeland as a consequence of people moving. In any event, let me kind of jump back a little bit and start with Angel Island for you. Who was here? Who were they? They were obviously members of the Hunan or Hainan group of Coast Miwok speaking peoples. The Hunan or Hainan were a nation that basically controlled Sausalito and what is today the Golden Gate recreational area. Let's call it the southern tip of Marin County. There were many, many nations of Coast Miwok people, many, many nations. There were probably 14 nations of Coast Miwok, and then again, we're my people, the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria, are Southern Pomo. And there were many nations of them. There was no such thing as Coast Miwok or Southern Pomo. Those are language classifications by linguists. Southern Coast Miwok, which is largely Marin County people speaking and living in Marin County, was a Penutian language. But as I said, there were 14 or so different independent sovereign nations. The language variation in Coast Miwok wasn't as great as it was in Pomo. Pomo is a Hokan-speaking language, Sonoma County and northward in Indian Lake County. But among the Coast Miwok-speaking peoples, of which the people of Angel Island were, the language variation was about as different as Old English to modern English, all right? But in the Pomo areas, the language variation was as different as French is from Italian or Portuguese or something like that. So there was much greater variation. The real question is, and what's interesting here, folks, is that question, the Hunan people on the island, on Angel Island, we know that from the we don't know any direct descendants. I'll talk about the history that we got lost in, or many of those people got lost in. But there was a large central village indicative of a sovereign nation with several smaller campsites or villages in different places on the island, all right? So that would indicate that, again, there was a nation state on the island, a sovereign or independent nation state there that spoke the same language as its neighbors across the water on the, let's call it the mainland, if you will, southern area. And they were, obviously, we were there part of a larger cultural linguistic complex. Let me begin by saying that there were more indigenous people right where you're sitting, right where Angel Island was, right where Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo is, this area here, the Bay Area, than there was anywhere else in pre-contact times outside of the present site of Mexico City. There were more people here living closer together, speaking languages that are as different as Urdu to Cantonese. The Hokan-speaking language, and all languages in the New World, all language families in the New World are found somewhere in California, represented in California, just to give you an idea of the complexity here. The Penutian language that was so-called Coast Miwok people were speaking is, again, as different as the Pomo language or Hokan language, again, as English would be from, say, Japanese. Completely different language families. And yet those old people here often spoke 10 languages, many as different, completely different languages. People asked, how did so many people living in one place, speaking so many different languages, get along with virtually no physical or very little physical warfare for upwards of 10,000 years that we know of? Well, of course, the early Spanish and the early Americans always considered the California Indians the dumbest of the natives. In fact, Junipero Serra and his Franciscan padres wondered of whether or not they were even worth converting. Were they fully human? All they did was sit around and they were naked all the time, seemed like they weren't doing anything. And again, let's think about this, folks. We always tend to value other people in terms of what we value. So the Europeans valued the Plains Indians, the most sparsely populated area of the New World. Why did they value the Plains Indians? Because they had what the Europeans valued, organized warfare, right? And caused them lots of trouble. They didn't understand California Indian history, how we lived together in such a complex way. We were very subtle. We had warfare, but it was based on a very different system. Let me talk a little bit about that system. Generally speaking, we had a philosophy that everything and everybody in nature had power, that if you violated it, it would come back on you, or what the old people used to call poison you, fix you. So I might be a good person, but if you violated me, stole from me, if I were a woman and you raped me, the next day or in the week ahead, someone in your family might drop dead. Yes, we had warfare. It was just subtle. We poisoned you. You dropped dead. People, the early ethnographers said California Indian cultures were predicated on fear and black magic. No. I believe we were predicated on profound respect, a constant reminder that we weren't the center of the universe and that we had to respect other things or suffer the consequences. That's, again, how we learned to get along with one another. Respect and things were fine. Disrespect, violate, and you start trouble. It was as much in our early creation stories, and everything led to that kind of worldview. There was not a centralized religion as such, although there were centralized ceremonies, but a lot of secret cults. And in fact, the most powerful that I always heard about was the women's grizzly bear cult. If there were a lot of people here, there were even more grizzly bears, but the women had communication with them. So again, rape and those kinds of things were unheard of. Again, I remember the old people sitting around and, somebody would die and they'd say, heart attack or stroke. So, and again, I was raised around, particularly Mabel McKay and Mrs. Parrish, Essie Parrish, are the dreamer at Kashaya. And, I would listen to them talk, and they would talk a lot about people who violated things and got poisoned. So, again, there was a very complicated belief system, religious system, that created a sustainable relationship with the landscape. To be a member of these secret cults, you often had to abstain from meat and sex for 7 years in your training. That kept the population down, kept you from killing more animals. And if your population began to grow and you began to violate your neighbors or take more territory, people would start to get poisoned. To put this in perspective, let me talk about a concept here. The Kashaya Pomo, southwestern Pomo, their word for Europeans or white people was pa'acha, and I always used to say, which means miracles. And I used to ask the old people, why do you call white people miracles? And they said, because when they came here, they were killing people, chopping down the forests, damming up the water, killing animals. And instead of getting punished, more of them kept coming. We thought they were miraculous. I ask all of you sitting here today, is there any human being that in fact is miraculous? We're all poisoned. There's not a drop of water, a breath of air where we sit that isn't poisoned right now. It's all come back. And we're seeing this now. We're seeing that in the power of nature and the world to give back, to fight back, to say, you better respect me or else. So the old people, they just had to wait about 150 years to see how things would come back. What happened? What happened to the people of Angel Island? What happened to this large indigenous population? At the time of contact in Marin County and southern Sonoma County, conservative estimates say there were about 20,000 of us. The Spanish came and established the first mission, Mission Dolores in San Francisco. And the Huinan people, the people of Angel Island and the southern tip of Marin County, Sausalito, were the first to get pulled into Mission Dolores in the late 18th century. Or 17th century rather. Yeah, 18th century, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around here. And certainly by 1800, 1810, they had come across the bay, taken many of the Coast Miwok people into the missions. In fact, it appears from archaeology that at that time, all of Angel Island was drained of people. Early on, right off the bat. All right. And then, of course, the two laws that they imposed upon us, the Spanish, were two laws. One against burning, because they assumed that the controlled burning that we were doing, they assumed that what we were doing was burning the grasses so that their cattle and horses couldn't eat. The other was a law against bathing, because they thought nudity was a sin. Put clothes on us. We have low resistance to European diseases. And again, through European diseases and the enslavement in the missions, and it was enslavement, separating men and women at night and all that kind of thing in separate quarters and that sort of thing, began to decimate us. People ran away. They tried to get back across the bay. But then it continued. The next mission was Mission San Rafael in 1812. that was originally built as a sort of hospital for all the dying Indians in Mission Dolores. So ironically, they were bringing some of us back to die in our homeland from where we were. And of course, the mission system was basically a feudal system where they needed labor to grow the crops and do those sorts of things. So Mission San Rafael then eventually moved from being a hospital or for the sick indigenous people to more and more people, a colony in and of itself. The last mission was built in 1823, Mission Solano or Sonoma, which again took many of us in. We resisted. There were wars, particularly with groups of Coast Miwok people in Petaluma area, and certainly the Santa Rosa Plains north heard about how horrible these missions were. So when the Padres came, and remember the Padres, you hear about the Spanish Padres and Junipero Serra. What people forget is, yes, the Padres were few in number. They couldn't go out and colonize and force people into missions. They were accompanied by the Spanish armies. The armies are what were marching people into the mission. So there were armies, and of course, they were claiming land for Spain. Think of the conflict. Think how confusing that was for us. Because all of a sudden, you're confronted with a people with a belief system that in so many ways is completely antithetical to you. The Spanish, the Europeans believe in a hierarchy. God's up here, then there's the king, who everybody's serving, then man, and of course woman below man, and all the way down to the bugs. It was totally antithetical to our way of thinking. It was a shock. And in fact, the landscape changed so quickly, and us having been removed from it, the landscape was our sacred text. It was a Bible. Features of the landscape were imbued with stories. They became mnemonic pegs on how we knew who we were. All of a sudden, the entire landscape looks different. All of you are familiar with the Golden Hills of California. There was no such thing. There were bunch grasses that were green or at least got a little faded during the summer maybe. But all of a sudden, the dung from the cattle and stuff, in a matter of a decade, transformed the landscape so that it looked completely different. New seeds, all of this sort of thing. The murder of the grizzly bears, great herds of elk and pronghorn were decimated. They'd run the elk and the pronghorn to the edge of the redwood forest on the western area and then shoot them all down. The elk and pronghorn wouldn't go in there because that's where the grizzly bears were. So there was, in a very short time, folks, total transformation of the landscape. Moving along, because I don't have a lot of time here, of course, there was the Mexican Revolution. Takes time to travel. They didn't have cell phones. The missions weren't secularized until 1834, a while after the Mexican Revolution. But that ushered in the Ranchero period. And again, these Mexican soldiers, who were great soldiers or generals, were given huge plots of land, and they got to play king or king. They enslaved the Indians using the same laws that the Spanish used to enslave, and the Spanish and Portuguese, to enslave the entire New World. They were Catholic. They didn't believe in slavery. But what they came up with is indentured servitude, vagrancy laws, and convict leasing. And using those things, they enslaved people. The Mexicans enslaved the Indians, the indigenous people, the survivors from the missions, in the same way. They used those laws so that if you were walking around and you didn't work for General Vallejo and couldn't claim that you did, you got put in prison and then your labor got sold. Okay? So again, this kind of unwritten legal slavery that went on. Of course, right close to us was the Bear Flag Revolution in Sonoma. And California became a state in 1850. General Vallejo, in this case, was defeated. The first piece of legislation, folks, enacted in the state of California was called the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians in 1850. It legalized Indian slavery, and guess who helped write the act and told the first governor of the state how to deal with these indigenous people? General Vallejo, who was defeated by this governor says, here, I'll help you write this legislation. Do what I did. Use these things to enslave the people, the Indian people. So that act was passed, and by the way, legalizing Indian slavery in California, and that was not repealed until 1868, 3 years after the end of the Civil War. It had another feature, a very ugly feature. It said, in addition to those three things that I outlined or mentioned, it said that with the permission of the parents, you could take the children. So, what if a parent said no? You didn't even have to ask. All you had to do is go around and kill the parents and take the children. So huge amounts, many of our children were taken, the parents murdered, the children taken to far and near and sold as slaves and servants for the early Americans coming in. After 1868, we became indentured servants on whosever land we could live on. And then we're moving up into, suddenly it's 1910, a lot of people pouring into California. We're still not citizens, by the way, US citizens, no recourse in the courts. And they create the California Indian Rancheria Act, which was to give little plots of land, because they had to get all these Indians somewhere. They had to do something with them because they're getting in the way of all these people moving into California. So they created this act for the quote-unquote homeless Indians of California. Homeless Indians of California. And they put us together. In the case of or where we are, they gave us 15.5 acres in Graton. And they said they created a de facto tribe of survivors. In this case, they said all the Indians of Marin, Tamales Bay, Bodega Bay, Sebastopol, and the vicinities thereof become the Graton Nation. So we had a little tiny sovereign nation of all these designees of the survivors. That act was terminated. That act was undone. There was the California Indian Rancheria Termination Act in 1958. The government didn't want to deal with us anymore. So we'll give you the option to own your land. Well, they came around in the summer when most of us were out working in the crops, and in the case of my tribe, it was August 1958. There were a couple older men that were left on the rancheria, and they said to these old guys, would you like to own your land? Sign here. The law said it had to be by consensus of the tribe. We were fooled, and many tribes in California who had been established as sovereign nations lost their sovereignty and became homeless Indians once again. Now, we did move ahead. In 1992, I was a young professor at UCLA, and the elders said, let's do something. And I wrote a bill, co-authored a bill. It took me 8 years to get it through Congress. And we went ahead and established a role, a base role. Finally, President Clinton signed it on December 27th, 2000, acknowledging that the United States of America illegally terminated us. And we're one of the last tribes to be restored by an act of Congress in this country. Now, we had to put together a roll. And we did. We put together a base roll. That was part of the requirement based on our having an ancestor who was a designee. All of us today, and there's about 1,500 enrolled members of the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria, all of us trace our ancestry back to one of 14 survivors, all of whom were women, all of whom were wives or concubines of the early Americans. That's out of a population of 20,000 approximately people here. So, you know, it's very interesting, folks, when you think of Angel Island and you think of the immigrants and the people who've come. And it's funny, you know, we talk a lot about immigration. We talk a lot about slavery. And Americans kind of pat themselves. They say, well, you know, slavery was bad, but we got rid of it. Never mind the legacy of slavery. They don't talk about that. They say, well, immigrants came here, or chose to come here. Never mind the circumstances under which they came. But how does America write the story of genocide and theft? More Indians that here. Well, again, this is a lesson, and it's nothing for anybody to us to get guilty about or to be sorry about, but to look at what can we learn from this history? What happened? How were people looking at a certain people on Angel Island such that the consequence of their worldviews made those people disappear and continued disappeared, probably until this class for many of you. So what do we learn? What do we learn from that? Let me just finish a little bit about the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria. I was a professor. We got our rights back, but we didn't get any land. Our little 15.5 acre rancheria was in private ownership. What do we do about that? And we didn't have any land. Land was expensive. We tried to think about organic farming or other things, but that wouldn't buy us any land. And people were beginning to discuss the C word, folks, and that wasn't cancer, that was casino. And I was a professor. I thought I did my part for my people, my elders. I got us through Congress. I got our rights back. I'd never been in a casino, and I had an elitist attitude, as many people do, especially rich people, privileged people, that casinos are déclassé. Oh, they do this they take poor people's money. There's addiction and all of that sort of stuff. Of course, they don't talk about wineries and alcohol because that's part of their world. And I didn't really understand that because I had some of those notions. And my non-Indian mother said, Greg, you can't leave your dad's people now because there's so many good examples of bad examples of people coming in and making bad deals with Indian people for money in this whole casino thing. So I said to my people and my council, I'll stay if this, and I realized with our proximity to the Bay Area that we could do great things. We had an opportunity, large, as they say, gaming population. I've learned all the words, folks. A professor with a PhD in modern thought and literature. I can tell you all about wins per unit and everything else now. But in any event, I said, okay, if this could be would benefit Indian and non-Indian alike and be a platform for social justice and environmental stewardship. So about not quite 9 years ago, we opened our casino. To date, through mitigation funds, we've given our homeland, Sonoma County, and the city of Roanoke Park, upwards of $200 million. We've donated over $60 million to charities that have to do with environmental stewardship and social justice, including committing $2.5 million a year to the University of California so that all California Indians, federally recognized or non-federally recognized, can attend the University of California tuition-free. We will continue to do great things. Precedent-setting co-management agreement with Point Reyes National Seashore. So once again, we're working to restore our landscape. The people who work in our casino, over 2,000 people, all have the Kaiser Gold Cadillac pen. They pay nothing out of their paycheck for full coverage. $10 deductible for brain surgery or aspirin. I probably need the former. And dental, medical, and we feed them. We have literacy programs. We have Spanish to English classes. Anybody with a green card, we walk you through, pay for your citizenship. So you do the right thing and with the opportunities you had. And I'm proud, yes, it can work. It sounded antithetical, a casino for environmental stewardship and social justice. But I ask, if Amazon would do what we did, we might have peace in the world. So we're trying to create a model. I've tried to create a model, and so far, so good. The survivors, those 14 women, what they went through and endured so that all of us could be here. Let's give back so that, in fact, all of us here today can find ways to be here. Thank you. How did I do on time? There's so much to say, folks, but
Tatsalach oichaloma. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm just here to ask you to speak some more. And I have a couple questions I want to begin with, and then I want to turn to this beautiful audience of eager minds to also pose some questions for our guest speaker today. I am grateful to you for this beautiful talk and for bringing forward these histories that are not so well known outside of California Native or Indigenous communities. One of the things I think that this Angel Island project is asking people to think about is how people survived incarceration. And one of the sort of resonant histories that you're bringing forward is this history of enslavement and incarceration in the missions, but also in these other forms, indentured servitude and so on. So I want to ask first if you would tell us a story or two that you know from your community. How did people survive? What were the walls they were writing on? What were the visions that kept them going? What stories do you know of how they survived?
well, regardless of what we did, and I think so often of the women, regardless of what we did, there had to be a profound love for the children and somehow a faith in the future, which is what should motivate any of us, a sense of family. So I know that, for example, my great-great-great-grandmother, who was born in the original village of Petaluma, she was at 14 captured by General Vallejo's soldiers, taken into the fort there, the Adobe, on Adobe Road. The Adobe's still there, people give tours of it. And she escaped, Beth, and walked 14 miles, or excuse me, she was 14 years old, and she walked 50 miles up to the Russian fort, Fort Ross. The Russians had colonized there, and the Russians weren't quite as vicious and difficult for the indigenous people as the Mexicans were. So the indigenous people understood that if they could escape the Mexicans and get up to Fort Ross, they would have a better chance of surviving being raped and so on and so forth. Also, the Russians were Russian Orthodox. They didn't convert. They weren't interested in converting to Catholicism as the Spanish and Mexicans who followed them did. So she walked, somehow got up there 50 miles north to the coast. And there she became, at a very early age, with a Creole, what they called then a Creole man, who was Russian, Aleut, and Kashayapomo, had 3 children from a man named Comparative. And the Russians then abandoned the fort in 1842, leaving these Indian people there, once again, prey to marauding slave traders who went up there to try to get the Indians away from, they didn't have the Russians to protect them. So a lot of the early Mexican and Americans were going up there to get the Indians. She went down to Bodega Bay, where there was Captain Stephen Smith from Boston, who had the first steam mill, processing all the redwood trees he was chopping, and she became the maid/mistress of Captain Stephen Smith and had a couple kids from him and named all her children and all the Indian people around there Smith, saying they were relatives. And so she worked in a way as a concubine there, so she could call all the people Smith, and nobody would come and steal any Smith because they belonged to Captain Stephen Smith, just as cattle or horses would. All right? And she did that to get us here. She was born speaking a Coast Miwok language. She died speaking 7 languages that we know of, including Spanish and Russian and English.
I think it's really interesting that you bring up the Fort Ross example, because I think some of the Aleuts would challenge you on whether the Russians were better.
They weren't
because-
better. I mean, you be careful. They were enslaved them. So yeah.
Yes, so the Russians captured Aleut people and brought them down to Fort Ross. But so there is this very, very complicated transnational and also circuits of indigenous life going on there, where there were the local California natives and then also the Aleuts who were enslaved by the Russians. And there were then these degrees of safety or possibility. And so when Native people were making decisions about how to survive, they were often, as you say, working within very constraining and difficult structures. Like the story that you just told us gives us a very complicated environment in which to choose the best of not good choices at all. But that desire to survive is still this underlying pulse. So thank you for telling us that story from your
In fact,
family.
the Aleuts, the Russians used them to hunt the otters, and they destroyed the otter population
Right.
here. And then when the trade, that's one of the reasons the Russians left, because they traded the pelts with China. So you had this international kind of trade thing going on, and they got rid of them. But no, just to be clear, the Russians also stole, that we know, 6 of our women, enslaved them on their ships when they left, and we never saw those women again. But about 20 years ago, descendants from Russia came home back. Wow, pretty amazing.
Yeah, one of the prominent Aleut families is the Californskis,
Yeah.
right? Named for California. So I wanted to shift over to this idea of the landscape being storied and reading the landscape. And I just want to say this is a beautiful book, even just the shape of it. So cheers to you and to Heyday Books for this beautiful volume. You have such a beautiful passage here. I wondered if you would read this to us. It's something you touched on earlier, but this part on page 67.
Thank you, Beth, and you squared it so I'll know where to stop.
Teaching.
All right, thank you. For Coast Miwok people, like all indigenous peoples of Central California, the landscape was nothing less than a richly layered text, a sacred book. Each ocean cove, even the smallest, seemingly unassuming rock or tract of open grassland, each feature of the natural world was a mnemonic peg on which individuals could see a story connected to other stories and thus know and find themselves home. Villages, indeed entire nations, were not only associated with particular locales, but actually named after them. I wonder what the name was for Angel Island.
I was hoping you might know what the name of...
I don't. In fact, that we looked at the mission records, and they mention a couple villages, but they're across the water on the mainland side, facing Angel Island. So they don't know. And that's, again, Angel Island then for us begs a question, how much don't we know about how many people? We know there were people there that knew that island so intimately. And probably 10, 15 times in their whole lives went off of it and went further. That's how well we knew the landscape.
Well, that's such a beautiful passage in the book, and such a great explanation of seeing the land as a storied place itself. And so I'm wondering if you can give some advice to this community of people who are embarking on reading Angel Island as a palimpsest, as a text that is written and written and written upon, but that where all the writings are still visible.
Well, first, thank you. That's a big question. But the fact that people are interested is heartwarming. The first thing to understand is once you go there, and even as you're reading it, now each of you is part of that story. So understand that you're here now, you're part of the story. And in bringing your story to this place now is a way for the place and what you're learning to help you begin to understand your own story. the importance of understanding a place, or even another people, or even another person, isn't that you know or learn things and suddenly put them in a box. In the best instances, it helps you understand what constitutes you as a cultured, historied person yourself. So don't push yourself aside. Be present as you engage, and dialogue with the place. And I think one of the best things that we can do, just as with the somewhat tragic, with certainly much of the tragic history that I outlined, is not to feel guilty, not to run away, not to want to go back, but to see that story and learn from it what we can do, starting with yourself and how you are present. You know, we were talking earlier, too many of us students and others of us want to run back and fix it and make it the way it was, or feel guilty about the news. Why live? Why do anything? You read the news. That's all a bad kind of influence to take you out of the opportunity of the moment. The opportunity of the moment. The sun comes up every day, folks. I love so much talking to students. I was a professor for 35 years, but because of the opportunity that you have. The more problems, the more opportunity. Don't be caved in.
Welcome, younger generations.
Yeah, more doors are open. And your curiosity and being present and learning will influence how you think about everything else in your world. So, the sun comes up. Don't worry. Be grateful that you're here. Say thank you to the sun. Get up. Get going. I'll tell you a quick story about Mabel McKay, who was a huge influence for me. And I remember she was a great Pomo medicine woman and basket weaver. And the last of her people to speak her language. Imagine being the last person speaking English or something. And anyway, we were at Stanford, and she always went down there because the Stanford professors and students, as she put it, always liked to analyze her. And so we were driving back, and I was taking her back to the Osher Theater reservation up near Woodland. And we're passing through Fairfield, and the hills were dry. And she said, this was 45 years ago, folks. And she said, everything's going to go dry. Everything's going to burn. She said, that's my latest dream. And we're coming to that point. And I was younger, obviously, and stupider than I am now, perhaps. And she said, and I said, Mabel, what do I do? What do we do then? If everything's going to go dry and we're going to burn. And she started laughing, and she goes, that's cute. What do I do? And she was always often making fun of me and my stupid questions and things. And I said, no, seriously, Mabel, what do we do? What do I do? And she took, as we say, folks, in the theater, a silent beat. And she looked at me and she said, you live the best way you know how. What else? Gregory Bateson, the great eco-philosopher, said, if we're all lemmings going over a cliff, we still have two choices. One, to walk with the rest and drop off, or scream as we go and say, hey, there's another way. Damn it, scream!
I feel like we should stop there, but we have more time, so, so we continue. Thank you for that perspective, and also bringing in that memory of Mabel McKay. I would like to hear you reflect a little bit about time and temporality. One of the things I think is interesting about Angel Island is that it's not named for a shape or even really, well, it's named for a time. It's named for a feast day. And I think Native people tend to think in very large scales of time. Part of this is about knowing the stories of the landscape. You tend to think in geologic time, like this is how this rock was formed, how this mountain was made, how these things came to be. How do you think about time and temporality? And also, this links back also to concepts of doing time, of incarceration, and other ways of being in relationship with time.
And again, it's interesting because Indigenous people, there's countless stories of us that go back thousands of years that that are passed down. You made me think, Beth, that remember, we were here when the bay was an open grassland. All right, wasn't that long ago. We were here. So we watched the waters rise, and we watched Angel Island become an island. Just remember that. That's how long. So when you talk about time, of course, everybody says to me, "Oh, you came down the Bering Straits." Oh, please. I always say, "I don't know about that, but I have my Bering Strait." And when you're talking about time and who's first and where you came from, how irrelevant when it's thousands of years. So, but let's get Angel Island. You know what I first began thinking about it? I know it was named after a feast day, but angels, I thought of spirits. I thought of the ancestors there. They're there. They're out there. Listen. And if you hear them, if people's voice to you, if you have memories of your great-grandparents or your grandparents, your young people or whatever who've passed, I remember a story Mabel told. She was becoming a doctor, and her great-great-grandfather, who she never knew, was talking to her, standing aside from her. And she said, "Is this my imagination? Am I going crazy? Great-grandfather, are you really there?" And you know what he said to her? "Well, if I'm not here, neither are you. Don't forget it."
And that's such a beautiful way to think about Angel Island. So this is my last question. So it's about to be on you, including Zoom people. Be ready to ask some questions. So this actually is about your practice as a writer. How do you place yourself in time, in land, in the works that you write? How do you bring life to the page?
With great difficulty. It depends on what I'm writing. I mean, sometimes if I'm writing, say, fiction about a period, I'll play here. But lately, now I'm doing these forgetter stories that kind of follow what happened after the people left Sonoma Mountain. And so I'm playing with the ways in which our myths and our stories play out in our lives today. So there's, in remembering a place and naming a place and storying the landscape once again, Beth, I'm trying as much as possible to go back to the time of creation, the whole mythical. Of course, mythical again is Western. It's bifurcating myth and reality. Let's break that down. As Mabel said, there's no such thing as imagination. Imagine that. Of course, I just sat on my own tail. But anyway, that's something. And again, our creation stories, they're the complete, again, to wrap up my discussion of my history here of different philosophies, we believe that there was that time when all the animals were still people, right? And that around the time the coyote did what he did, creating from Sonoma Mountain there. And long story short, because I don't have time, but one of the people or animals got very greedy and did a trick to get deer to go into his house, and then tried to kill her, to eat her. And she went out screaming, and she said, "This guy in there's turned on us. He's tricking. He's going to eat us." And at that point, all of the people grew wings or big claws or long legs, beautiful feathers, and flew and ran away. The dumb one that was left was the human. And we are left as human beings to renegotiate our relationship with the rest of creation. Notice that difference between the Judeo-Christian notion of us being on top and created by God in his image. Here it is, from the beginning, we're humbled. We weren't so smart after all. And think about it. We don't have great claws. We don't have anything but our stories and our minds to remind us to be part of everything.
That's such a great story. And I just want to make this little comment to connect it to some of our Nez Perce stories. One thing is, in our language, we have a suffix for myth time or remote time. And in our stories, the temporal markers are moving back and forth between myth time and present and simple past. And so there's that infusion across these different temporal and these different realities that all exist in the same time and place, even though they also have their discrete identities. And also in our stories, humans are just pathetic. Just without the animals, we owe them everything because they took pity on us and continue to. So yeah, that humility and that interrelationship, I think, is something that's very pervasive in Indigenous societies. Absolutely. Coming out of the stories.
Yes. Well, one more thing is Mabel McKay always used to say to me, whether you believe it or not, it's true.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Looking for a hand to shoot up, or 10, or who has a question? Oh, I see you right here in the middle. Oh, sorry.
This is like my general tribal council
It's like
meetings.
Oprah.
Yeah.
Thank you for these memorable stories. I am an architect, and I work in historic architecture and preservation of landscape. And coming back to your story about land in Marin County, and of course, so many places in California that were owned by indigenous people, and they conserved it and they built upon that, and not all of them were able to stake any claim on it. Lands were stolen. Is there an effort, or can there be an effort, and if so, what do you envision, of land that, say, now is being managed by National Park Service, may have, be part of, say, a historic district, but is not, indigenous people are not acknowledged in those kind of associations? So just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you for asking, and it provides me an opportunity just to give the example of what my tribe has done. First of all, in our area where there's regional parks, my tribe is creating co-management agreements with the county. So, and at co-management, we mean 50-50. We have as much say on the restoration of that landscape and the use of that landscape as the county, public lands owners in this case. We've recently, and I'm very proud, created and signed a co-management agreement with the entire Point Reyes National Seashore. So that's 50-50, the tribe working now with the national government, having equal say how that land's going to be restored and managed and used by the public. So those are examples. There's a lot of land back movements. But one of the things we have to remember is that often tribes, particularly here in California, may not have the resources to do a lot with large swaths of land. So we have to partner. We have to work together to restore the landscape. A lot of people want to, just tear down all the fences and just let a million elk run all over it. Well, there's Highway 1 and things like that. And if we can't go back the way it was. We have to find ways using the ethics, and I will say aesthetics of indigenous cultures to work towards sustaining a landscape, taking care of the oak trees again, doing what we can piece by piece. I laugh because now that we're co-managing, a lot of the environmentalists will say, well, just tear down all the fences and let all the elk go and get rid of all the dairies and stuff. And the dairies are problematic. I will acknowledge that as far as polluting. But the other thing is, do you really want cougars and grizzly bears back here? I love it, the environmentalists and people, the first grizzly bear eats somebody's kid, we'll get rid of the grizzly bears. So we have to think, where are we now? Let's work together. Let's see what we can do, indigenous and non-indigenous, together to create, again, a landscape that reflects sustainability.
Another question up here in the corner.
Hi, I'm amazed with all of the great work. I just wanted to know more about how to get a bill to pass.
You're going to pull up the cynical Greg. How to get a bill to pass. There's an easy answer, but then I won't be flippant, but I'll start by being flippant. It depends on how much money you have and who you know. That's the sad news. That's reality. So when I had that bill, I didn't have any money. I was a professor and not all of that. But I had made a movie with Robert Redford. One of my books was a 3-hour miniseries, Grand Avenue on HBO. And persistence, belief. Anybody can, again, write a bill. As you're saying, getting it out of the hopper is the big thing. Okay, so that's really tough. And at that time, I put pressure on Barbara Boxer, who was the senator at that time, Lynn Woolsey, who was our local congresswoman. And I was persistent. I just beat them and talked about social justice and your liberals and all. I played on their guilt. You say all these things, here's your chance to do something. Finally, Barbara Boxer took, I guess, out of guilt, and maybe was afraid some of my movie friends would come after her. I don't know. I don't know. But she did the right thing, regardless of her motivation or what it was. She took my bill and stuck it as a rider on a larger bill about something about kitchen sinks, and it sailed right through. Politics, folks.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm a society and environment major, and I'm a first year at Berkeley. So my question is, what is some advice that you have for a younger generation or to be better advocates for Indigenous peoples and for strengthening environmental policies to reflect a more sustainable future? And what are some resources we can look into after this presentation?
Wow, there's a lot there.
Yeah, sorry.
But my first, welcome to Berkeley, and I'm proud and glad that you're here. But keep studying what you're studying. You're on the right track already. And so it's really important, regardless of what you do, that you understand how you need to do what you do. And studying what you're doing, environmental issues, will give you ways of thinking of them in complex ways. So to answer your question, and I'm not avoiding specific answers, studying and understanding, and that's what's so good about the university and learning, is it gives you a broader and broader perspective on how to think about a problem, and then how to figure out what is the right thing to advocate for, and how are the best ways to advocate for it? And that's what you need to know. And when you know that, then you'll know the policies you need to support, advocate, and do those sorts of things. Right now, watch for some of the kinds of things, the restoration programs. I think it's fascinating to learn and see some of the indigenous folks, what they're restoring, they're doing, and the kinds of things that are going on. And they're around. We're doing certain things with our tribe, the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria. And there's many other things. There's many, I think, also great organic, sustainable farming practices that are going that are so important. In our tribe, it's two-pronged. Our environmental program is two-pronged. One is environmental partnership and restoration of the Aboriginal landscape, but the other is organic farming. So we are now producing enough food to provide vegetables for our elders and others. And I hope eventually to produce enough food to sell at cost in low-income neighborhoods. So you take the good and you spread it. Think that way.
Thank you.
I see that there are many questions still and people eager to follow up with other questions, but I also am aware that we need to move out of the building soon. So I'm going to thank you again for this wonderful presentation and conversation, and Susan to come back up and close.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Susan. Thank you for being so good. Thank you. Thank all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg Sarris and Beth Piatote. I enjoyed your conversation. I learned so much. And students, next week we have Lenora Lee and Ava Roy talking about site-specific theater and dance at Alcatraz and Angel Island. And we have the field trip coming up on September 10th. Lenora Lee's dance is available through next weekend, and I look forward to seeing you. Oh, and don't forget to turn in your attendance cards. Is there anything else? Oh, and so on the attendance cards, just as a reminder, since we're early in the semester, write your name, the speaker's name, one main takeaway, the most interesting or important thing you learned today, and then one question you still have remaining about the topic or that you would have for the speakers. So, great. Okay, thank you, everybody.